This video is going to look at the rhetoric of viruses from a psychoanalytic perspective, and especially dealing with the way we use the term virus in contemporary culture, especially in the period of COVID-19. Much of this video comes from my book, Viral Rhetoric, Psychoanalysis, Philosophy, and Politics After COVID-19. So some of the questions I want to address are, why do we say a video has gone viral? So how is the term viral being used there? What does it mean for a computer to get a virus? And why do we use viruses as metaphors? And then finally, how can psychoanalysis help us to understand our responses to AIDS and the COVID-19 virus? So one thing I want to stress here is that we're seeing in many different fields is a combination and often a confusing of different discourses, especially the discourse of biology, culture, technology, and psychology. And Freud argued that the fundamental primary processes use a type of animism, where what is going on is basically we're confusing our inner thoughts with external reality, so that we basically project our thoughts onto reality, and we see our thoughts as true and real because we have used this mental process of projection, which on a fundamental level is what structures a hallucination. So thoughts are perceived as reality. And so we're projecting our symbolic ideas onto the real. And Freud adds that this process is automatic. So in some ways, we are like automatic symbolic poets, because there's a primary use of rhetoric in the sense that our thoughts are structured by symbolic association, substitution, and displacement, but we're not in control of our own minds. And so in this way, on the fundamental primary processes in our minds, our thoughts are structured by symbolic rhetoric, but we have no direct control over it. So as an example of how we see the use of rhetoric and the virus, we can look at a explanation. This is a quote from a discussion of the viral theory of cancer. And so the quote says, viral oncogenes disrupt the normal cellular gene expression and signal transduction pathways. The signal transduction pathway is responsible for altering cellular gene expression in response to a wide range of external and internal signals. And what I want to stress in this viral theory of cancer is that there's a constant use of metaphorical language. So even when we have expert scientists speaking to each other, they still use different rhetorical devices. And so this goes against the idea that scientists speak in a completely neutral, clear, and unpoetic language. What we find instead is a constant use of analogies, metaphors that are made possible through symbolic associations. So for instance, saying that DNA is a language, that basically there's a language that needs to be decoded, which defines our biology and ultimately defines different aspects of nature. What we're doing is we're projecting our understanding of language and linguistics onto nature itself. And we see this in some examples in the last passage, where they talk about genes expressing themselves. And here we have a projection of human psychology onto nature. Also, the focus on biological signs, signals, information, and instructions. We often see this when people are talking about genetic codes and the fact that DNA is a language, and that biology therefore is a language, and that nature is a book that has to be read. We also see a projection of subjectivity onto biology when we use terms like the genes are responsible, or the genes enact a certain intentionality. So what we find here is just a fundamental mixing of linguistics, computer science, biology, and psychology. So to look at another example, this is from a discussion of computer viruses. So worms are programs that replicate themselves from system to system without the use of a host file. This is in contrast to viruses, which require the spreading of an infected host file. So I just want to stress here the term virus and the term infection, and this idea that a computer system can be infected and that it can have a virus. Although worms generally exist inside of other files, term worms itself is a natural entity that is used to describe a technology. Often Word or Excel documents, there's a difference between how worms and viruses use the host file. Usually the worm will release a document that already has the worm macro inside the document. Once again, there's also this language of intentionality. The worm will release. And this idea that there is a certain intentionality in these natural and mechanical structures. So this notion that the computer has a virus and that it's been infected and that the virus replicates and it contains a hidden worm, we have to question, why are we confusing biology with technology? And also, why do scientists rely on this symbolic language? Is this just a confusion of tongues? So a key question to ask here is, in this mixing of different discourses, in this projection of linguistics into nature and of intentionality into non-intentional structures, is this just an effort to communicate through the use of rhetoric and metaphor, or is something else going on? So Jean Baudrillard argues that what is fundamentally going on is that we've lost our cultural immune system. So we could say that different disciplines and discourses used to be separated and kept separate, just like we say the separation of church and state or the separation of three branches of government. Um, we used to have more of a separation between science, psychology, and also between language and nature. But according to Baudrillard, all of these discourses have been freed from their original meanings, and so that they're free to circulate and combine with other discourses. And so he says we have lost our cultural immune system, and this is a social form of AIDS, which itself, of course, is a metaphor. That this lost boundary between different discourses allows these discourses to spread into new regions, and that we see how technology helps the spread of culture and the combination of these different discourses. And that once language has been severed from its original meaning and essence, um, Baudrillard says the systems expand until they no longer provide their original functions. And so he says we've been liberated from everything, not only liberated from different forms of oppression, but we've been liberated from meaning itself, and that metonymy or contingent connections has replaced metaphor. And so what we're seeing in all aspects of culture is this viral spread of contingent connections. So primary question is, are we moving to a single interdisciplinary discourse, or are we just projecting one field onto the other? In the book, The Information, we see some of the foundations for this combination of biology, technology, and psychology, and how theories of language are projected onto nature. And really starting in the 70s and then moving into the 80s, we start seeing geneticists, computer scientists, and cognitive scientists borrowing from each other, using the same principles, theories, and concepts. And so we start with this idea that DNA is a code, and that there's computer codes, and that there's linguistic codes, and that computer codes can be reduced to the alternation of zeros and ones, plus or minuses, and that genetic code has four central elements, GATC, and that we can decode genes, and that we can structure computer representations through this manipulation of 2 or 4 variables. And then we see this idea that just like there are genes that carry genetic information, there are means that replicate social and cultural information. And more, the idea is presented that even natural entities are really information processing machines. So we have this idea that the mind is an information processor, that biology itself provides instructions and language and codes and is a form of computational processing. And so, once again, what we're experiencing in this new form of animism, and which can also be called scientism, is this idea that basically what science discovers actually exists in nature. So it's not just that science is trying to represent and approximate through consensus and probability different aspects of nature. The idea is that these codes, this language, linguistics itself is within nature. And the whole universe then is seen as being mathematical and linguistical. So the question is, what are the risks of this combination of discourses? And so one thing is that we misunderstand what science is. And we see this currently with the reaction to COVID-19, is that people are often rejecting the science when it's not perfect, when it's not complete. And I think this idea that science should be perfect is in part generated by a lot of scientists themselves who seek to find this perfect match between their representation of nature and nature itself. We see this especially in neuroscience and in evolutionary psychology, where what is represented is basically a total knowledge of nature, and the idea that it's not just that we're trying to represent biology or evolution, but that biology and evolution themselves are structured by the same concepts and principles. Um, and so scientism, we can understand, as opposed to science, is this fantasy of a total fit between nature and culture. But as I said before, science works through abstraction, approximation, consensus, and reality testing, trial and error. It's never complete, it's never perfect, it's never whole, and that there's this fundamental distinction, as Lacan stresses, between our symbolic representations of reality and reality itself. So, one effect of projecting language onto nature, of seeing DNA or biology as a language and a code, is that we naturalize culture and we see nature through a cultural and political lens. And so this is very important. By saying that we naturalize culture, meaning like we tend to see culture, which is historically and socially constructed, we tend to see it as natural, meaning inevitable, meaning it's always going to be that way, it's unchangeable, there's no reason to intervene in it or to try to change it. So when we take, for instance, gender hierarchies, gender differences, and we see them as completely natural, we are basically saying that these hierarchies and distinctions are justified and they can't be changed. And the other side of that equation is we start seeing nature from a political perspective. And we see this in the political fight over COVID-19 virus. So what we're seeing is science is becoming increasingly politicized, and that scientists themselves are often creating fictions, called the science fictions, in the sense that what they're representing is this total match between their theories and what they're trying to explain, nature or reality itself. But as Lacan says, there is no meta language. There's no way of escaping our use of language in order to explain things. And so we end up using different forms of rhetoric like metaphor in order to structure science itself. Now, in my book, I look at Rushkoff's book, Media Virus. It was a book that he wrote early on when the internet started to take off. And one of his arguments is that the media is alive, that we can't control it, that like a virus, it spreads and replicates. It has its own agenda, he argues, and that he sees it in this very progressive or liberatory way, in the sense that it undermines all authority and hierarchy from his perspective. And that he stresses the way that more and more media is becoming unscripted, and first through the use of, say, personal home recorders, but also, through reality media, reality TV, reality-based media. The idea is to move beyond the old stale form of scripted and controlled media and try to make the media itself feel real. And so what he constantly stresses in his book is that with the internet, what we're seeing is the media itself coming alive and becoming viral. So once again, one of the effects of seeing the media as a virus is that by making it appear to be a natural entity, we see it as inevitable. We also lose the distinction between what is fiction and reality. And this is one of the things with reality TV, which parts are edited, which parts are scripted, and that there's a general confusion or a lack of distinction made between fiction and reality. And this allows us to project our minds and culture onto the media, which is itself then seen as natural. And it is represented often as a form of liberation. And I see this as an aspect of the current right-wing libertarian politics, this idea that we want our politicians to be real, authentic. So Trump really played on this idea that not only was he a reality TV star, but that he refused to be censored, he refused to be scripted, he was talking directly to the people through his Twitter account. And so there is this attempt in politics and culture to try to make fake things appear real. And this is done as a way of trying to bond with the people by saying that in this form of libertarian populism of the right, this idea that the politicians are no longer elitist, they're no longer fake, they're not hypocrites, but they say what's ever on their mind without being censored by political correctness. So I often also spend a lot of time in my book talking about Freud's theory of the contagion. So Freud wanted to also look at um, how do ideas and emotions circulate in groups. And he was writing this right before the rise of the Nazis. And he's trying to explain basically the foundations of group psychology and why people will submit to a leader, to a lover, or to a cause. And so by analyzing the structures of the army, of the church, but also of political rallies and ultimately fascism, Freud found the same thing that he discovered when he used hypnosis, which is that people would submit with blind obedience to an authority once they placed that authority in this position of the ideal object. And so what would happen in hypnosis, but also in the army and the church and the political group, is there's a loss of reality testing as the individual sacrifices to the social. And there's always, as in hypnosis, this type of fascination, and we can relate to the fascist nation in the sense that there is this focus on a single object or voice or look. And through this absorption or this singular focus on a particular idea or individual or cause, one becomes blind to everything outside of that realm. And so one stops testing reality, one gives up their morality. And Freud said this is based on regressing to the original relationship between the helpless infant in relationship to the all-powerful caregiver. And so he argued that what's happening in these social groups and in the hypnotic relationship and in passionate love is that we find this same type of regression to a primary relationship of helplessness in the face of an all-powerful other. And he said that this is really the foundation of the psychoanalytic concept of transference, where basically in analysis, not only will the patient fall in love with the analyst, but the patient will place the analyst in the position of being all knowing, all loving, and basically of an all powerful father figure or God figure. And this causes blind obedience and a passionate or mad form of love. But Freud also looked at the way that emotions can spread in a group. And he called this hysterical empathy. He gives the example of a girl in a boarding house who receives a breakup letter. She starts to cry, and all the other girls in the group cry through a process of empathy and identification. So he said a key to the spread of emotions, but also to irrational ideas like conspiracy theories, occurs through this process of hysterical identification. And that within the hysterical group, there is a shared regression, so that there's a dominance of the primary processes in the unconscious, and also a freeing of the drives and feelings of violence or sexuality are often enabled by the group. And Freud stressed that the group prefers illusions over truth, and that in front of someone who has social or cultural prestige, he says the critical thinking is paralyzed. So Freud added that emotions feed off of each other, that followers bond over a shared enthusiasm, and that groups often feel an unlimited sense of power as there's a removal of inhibitions and of their conscience, and that they're often unified by a shared hatred of an outside group, and that the group itself is a type of libidinal, emotional, and sexual tie, um, and that the people in the group identify with each other's suffering through a fundamental victim fantasy. So we often find groups um, are connected and identified through a sense of a shared martyr or a shared scene of victimization. And we see this, for instance, in religion, of course, with people, Christians wearing crosses, a scene of victimization, and people identify through the suffering of their group. And so one thing that we find, currently with the reactions to COVID-19 is this form of emotional identification and the circulation of ideas through conspiracy theories using the media, but also the media as a way of allowing for this identification of people that are physically separate, but connect together through shared ideas and shared emotions. And so Freud does is he removes the idea of the contagion, or that an idea can be contagious, that laughter can be contagious, that even yawning can be contagious. And he wants to remove it from a biological explanation. So there's always this idea like, why, when someone laughs, do other people laugh? Like, is there a physical element that makes laughter contagious? And Freud uses the theories of identification and idealization and the group formation in order to explain this form of the contagion and to separate it from a type of biology. And something that he points out is, and this is what Lacan highlights, is this idea that the desire of the subject is the desire of the other, and the other in the sense that we learn what to desire by identifying with other people, that our identity is developed through identification. And so then it is no surprise that we share ideas or that we share emotions or that we are susceptible to submitting our free will to a group process. And ultimately, he said that we're driven to escape. And we see this in Eric Fromm, of course, his book Escape from Freedom, that what kind of drives our submission to the group is a desire to escape from any sense of responsibility or freedom or reality. In a sense, that the way that we try to escape feelings of guilt and shame is by denying responsibility and making some ideal other responsible. And this is one way of thinking about transference. We're transferring responsibility onto an idealized other. And Freud also adds that what happens in the hypnotic relationship and the love relationship and these group formations is that we place the object of our desire in this position of being sublime. And here we see this idea that Zizek presents of the sublime object of ideology. But for Freud, it's clearly the sublime object is a product of our own imagination and also the social structure where certain ideals and ideas are privileged and given power, and that we submit to those privileged ideas. So the question is, what can be done about this mixing of discourses and this spreading of ideas and this type of spreading of conspiracy theories? So one thing that I try to stress is that we need to separate biology, psychology, technology, and culture. And so we have to stop seeing culture as natural, meaning inevitable, but we also have to stop seeing nature through a purely cultural lens. We have to understand that there are limits to science and that we have to start to interpret and understand the way that we automatically use rhetoric in our thinking, and that even in science, we need to decode and understand the uses of rhetorics, because rhetorics, while they can help to explain something, they often also cause a displacement of meaning. So what is happening when you're comparing two different things is, on one hand, you're finding some similar meaning or value, but you're also displacing the meaning of one thing onto the other. And so if we effectively learn to separate our thoughts from reality, then we can maintain a certain level of critical distance, which allows for an aspect of responsibility and freedom instead of seeing everything as inevitable and as predetermined, or giving total or transferring responsibility onto an idealized other. We have to maintain this critical introspection and critical distance. And in part, this is understanding the limits of science and stopping projecting politics onto biology, and also distinguishing not only biology from linguistics, but also separating the human mind from computers. Thank you.